After our honeymoon in St Petersburg, we began the long journey back to Nizhny Novgorod, traveling by train through Moscow, a journey of nearly 700 miles across Russia. We had booked a 4-berth sleeper. It was cheaper than a 2-berth, the only downside being that we would be sharing the compartment with strangers. In our case, those strangers turned out to be 2 FSB officers, which, if you grew up in the Cold War, you can't help but think of as the KGB. Our first impressions came as the compartment door slid open. 2 young men, probably in their 30s, stepped in, both dressed neatly in dark suits. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence, not unfriendly, but watchful, the kind of presence that makes you instinctively sit up just a little straighter. Nadia began speaking in Russian, clearly introducing us. I caught the familiar sound of Nadia, Steve, and then the rest flowed past in a rapid stream of Russian that, to me, was simply a blur of sounds without meaning. Nadia later told me their names, though I have to admit, I can't remember them now. It was nearly 24 years ago, and somewhere along the way the names slipped quietly out of memory, leaving only the feeling of that moment behind. I stood up with a smile and offered my hand. They both smiled warmly and, one after the other, shook it with a firm, energetic grip, a simple gesture that seemed to say we'd get along just fine, whatever the journey might bring. They spoke a little English, and I explained that I was British, born and raised in Newcastle, a Geordie. That drew a couple of curious looks, and they glanced toward Nadia for translation, which she gave with a small smile. One of them brightened slightly and said, "Newcastle, the football team." I smiled and nodded. Yes, Newcastle United, the Magpies. There was a shared nod of recognition, the universal language of football doing its quiet work. They each tapped their chests and said with quiet pride, "Spartak Moscow." Conversation began to flow more easily after that. The 2 young men spoke mostly with Nadia, their Russian moving far too quickly for me to follow, and from time to time she would turn to include me, translating a question, a joke, or a small detail, so that I was gently drawn into the rhythm of their conversation. I found myself listening more than speaking, watching the expressions, catching the tone, and slowly feeling at ease. After a while, Nadia leaned toward me and explained that they were asking if I'd like something to eat. Each of them had brought food in their backpacks and insisted we share. They were about to head to the narrow space between the carriages, where passengers stood for a smoke, and invited us to come along. Nadia decided to stay in the compartment, so I followed them along the gently swaying corridor. In the small space between the carriages they unpacked their provisions, a dark bread, slices of sausage, and a bottle of clear liquid. I smiled to myself. That was most certainly not water. One of them made a small demonstration, sleeve to nose, then a nod toward the bread. "Hey," I said, understanding, and he smiled. "Stops you getting drunk," he explained. We shared a few drinks, some food, and more of those ritual little sniffs, the easy rhythm of conversation settling in as the train carried us through the night. Through a mixture of simple English, gestures, and shared stories, I found myself telling them about my time in the army, a few years that had taken me to places and experiences far from home. Time slipped by almost unnoticed. Eventually I glanced at my watch and did a double take. How long have I been here? I thanked them warmly and said I'd better head back to Nadia. When I returned to the compartment, she looked up and said, "Where have you been?" "You've been away nearly 2 hours with them." I laughed. We had some food and probably a few too many vodkas. She gave me a look and said quietly, "Don't you know who those guys are?" "No, they told me earlier. They're both FSB officers. One of them is a major heading home on leave." I sat down beside Nadia, letting that sink in, the easy laughter of the last couple of hours taking on a slightly different shade. I smiled at Nadia. "Well, that explains the firm handshake." She gave me a look, rolled her eyes in that familiar way, and then smiled. We climbed into our bunks, and I was out like a light almost immediately, the gentle motion of the train doing the rest. We didn't see much of the two men for the remainder of the journey. They were in and out of the compartment, and so were we, the quiet rhythm of travel carrying us all onward through the night. By morning, the journey was drawing to a close and we were nearing our stop, while the two men were continuing on for several stations more. As we gathered our things, the major reached into his bag and handed me a cardboard box containing 6 bottles of Baltica No. 3 beer, along with a small note bearing his telephone number. He smiled and said, "Steve, get Nadia to ring me. We will come and collect you both, and I will treat you to a night on the town." I thanked them warmly, and as we stepped down onto the platform, we stood together watching the train pull away, raising a hand in farewell as it gathered speed and carried them onward. Nadia looked at me and said firmly, "No way are we ringing them, and no way are we going out with 2 FSB officers." She paused, then added with a knowing look, "Do you want to see the inside of Lubyanka prison?" I decided it might be wiser to leave that particular invitation unanswered. And like so many moments on that journey, it became one of those stories you carry quietly with you, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters become the ones you remember most.